Hello, everyone. Welcome to Frank Analysis. I am your host, Franco, and I'm joined today by John Potash. He is a researcher and author. And we're going to talk about two books that I just read recently that John wrote. We're going to talk about the FBI war on Tupac Shakur, as well as the drugs as weapons against us. And I got to say, John, thank you very much for writing those books. It was really well researched. There's a lot of decades worth of information there put together, and I was so invested in it that I read the Tupac book in like 3 days, and the
That's
drugs
great.
as a weapons against us, I was like less than a week.
That's
So,
it's nice to hear. Thanks. I'm glad you liked it so much.
yeah. So let's start by going over like what is it that got you into researching drugs and how it's used in the music industry.
Well, I was just interested in social activism in general, and of course, like most people, I just like music a lot, and I happen to be into a lot of different kinds of music, like alternative, music, whatever that's supposed to mean. But of course, I like Nirvana. When they came out, I had no like independent label music at that time, but eventually, of course, got into Kurt Cobain and Nirvana. But I'd also liked rap growing up. Was introduced to some of the early, rappers in, when I graduated from high school in 1983. Just by some friends I wrestled with around the state of around Baltimore City, and and then stayed interested in Public Enemy and other social activist rappers, and uh, just didn't even actually know of Tupac when I first started writing about him because he just was off my radar. I was into Public Enemy and different people like that, Tribe Called Quest and other bands. But when I heard first, like heard a song of his and heard about really, first heard about him when I was reading the Washington Post, and I read Another Strange Twist. The same police arrived at his shooting scene when he was shot in the skull twice and didn't die, as it showed up a year earlier in a supposed purported sexual assault scene. And so I had been writing an activist novel at the time based on the ideas of drugs as weapons against us. And that, I ended up turning that into drugs as weapons against us. But I had characters that were based on the Black Panthers, and I was studying the New York Black Panthers, and all the leading New York Black Panthers were the Shakurs. And so when I saw Tupac Shakur's name, I thought, I wonder if they're targeting him like they targeted his Black Panther parents. And so I cold called his lawyer, his New York trial lawyer, and he just talked to me for an hour or two. He read the same activist magazines as I did, and was really happy that somebody was writing an article, with this angle. He said because nobody was writing about this angle on Tupac Shakur being an activist.
Yeah, and then he was sort of like born into that too because of his mother, Afeni Shakur, was a Black Panther, and she was a target by um by intelligence. Like they
Hmm.
were going after trying to divide them. The whole East Coast West Coast beef that was created during the '90s era of rap is similar to the division that they try to create with the Black Panthers.
Right.
So, what can you tell us a bit about how intelligence infiltrated the Black Panthers and other activist groups during the '70s?
Yeah. So basically, in the late 1960s and early 70s, the FBI's counterintelligence program, it really wasn't known. It didn't find no one found out about it until activists raided an FBI office and stole all the FBI files. That's the first time they got clear written proof that there was a program being waged against them by the FBI, leading local police intelligence against them. But it was, it started in the 1950s, went into the 1960s, and was particularly brutal in the late 60s and early 70s. But it was, obviously against the leading Black Panthers. You might have seen the film Judas and the Black Messiah about the, FBI murder of Fred Hampton, the leader of the Illinois Black Panther Party in Chicago, in his sleep. They basically drugged him that night. An undercover agent who infiltrated the Black Panthers drugged him that night over dinner, He was asleep when they shot him. They killed him in his bed, and it was horrible. But they did that to other Black Panthers too. They used different means to assassinate other Black Panthers. And of course, they targeted the Harlem Black Panther chapter, which was a huge chapter. Chicago and the Harlem Black Panthers were two of the biggest chapters, along with the Oakland chapter and the Los Angeles chapters. And so they pitted New York, Afeni Shakur. That's how she pronounces her name. A little strange, but Afeni Shakur's Harlem Black Panthers against, and the whole New York Black Panther 21 of the top leaders that were arrested around the city and were on trial, the longest trial in New York history. They pitted them with fake letters and undercover agents against the national office in Oakland. And so it was similar to like the East Coast, West Coast kind of, division set up. Now, it wasn't exactly the same, of course, but they used some of the same techniques with fake letters and the undercover agents, making false claims to pit them against each other. And so, I found the same techniques used between to divide Tupac with his friend Biggie Smalls, and to divide the East Coast, Puff Daddy against Suge Knight and all that, and Death Row versus Puffy's label and all that. So that's just that I saw all the same techniques, and the media was always used as assets to create the divisions too. But that was just to cover what was the best evidence is a latter day COINTELPRO against Tupac that murdered him. And the reason they did that, first thing, an FBI undercover agent said his fellow agents, he was part of COINTELPRO. He said he was his name was Wes Swearingen, and he came out with a memoir in the mid 1990s. And he said, my fellow agents are still working. Tell me that it's continuing. COINTELPRO is continuing under different names. So when they uncovered it by stealing the files from an FBI office, they just closed it down officially, but unofficially they kept it open under different names. And so that's just some of the massive evidence that they assassinated Tupac, because behind the scenes, he was only pretending to be a gangster in order to appeal to gangs and politicize them. Really, he was an intellectual prodigy, and he was a serious activist. And he was getting the Bloods and Crips to call peace truces and turn on to activism. And he was incredible force that way. And he was getting the various gangs around the country to stop drug dealing and turn on to activism, including New York's largest gang, the Latin Kings, who changed themselves to the almighty Latin King and Queen Nation, according to New York professors who wrote a book about that transformation. And so that transformation alone took 3,000 potential drug dealers off the streets and turned them on to activism. And that's a huge blow to the CIA's drug trafficking and profiting, and a huge blow to the money laundering of those drugs, which even makes much more money on the stock market.
Right. The reason why they brought drugs to the United States and introduced them to poor Black and brown communities is so that they can profit off of that. Not only, by trafficking the drugs, but also by incriminating them and putting them in the prison industrial system, and using their slave labor.
And for social control in general.
Yeah, which you touched on also in Drugs as a Weapon, like how they would use that against the 60s movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, right? And I want to get into that a little bit later. First, I want to talk about like what you discussed with Tupac, which a lot of you quoted a lot in the book about how Tupac said he never had a record until he made a record. And before that, he was like a young activist leader. He wasn't really targeted much that time. It was when he gained that influence, right? When it became a problem, when he came out with that first music video, Trapped, which was a very political song. And that's when he also came out with his first album, Tupacalypse Now, Brenda Has a Baby. All these songs that at the time were called reality rap. It was when the media started calling it gangster rap, when people like NWA and other groups were talking about like some of the behavior that these people undergo in their communities. But what can
Yeah.
you tell us about that?
Yeah, no, that was actually might have been his most political album. Was his first CD, but soon after, somewhere around the time of that coming out, is when he made a plan with his uh, just released from prison stepfather Matulu Shakur, who was an incredible acupuncturist. He's the first. He's the pioneer of acupuncture for drug addictions in the United States. Really amazing what he's done to start that, and that spread throughout North America. But he is a great activist and a great acupuncturist, and Tupac planned with him to pretend to be a gangster in order to appeal to gangs and politicize them, and also to politicize other rappers.
Yeah.
And so he only was, he only took on that thug persona for that purpose. But so he, in his second album, he does, use more slang, but he still had the activism in, strictly for my Niggaz, album. And he just, he just kind of got a little went on tangent with his third album because he produced it, but a lot of it was when he was being in jail. Was put out when he was in jail, and he was more controlled after that. As soon as he put out his first album, Time Warner bought a majority rights over his Death Row Records label and controlled his music more and made it less political on purpose. Cut out some of his more political songs. And so, nonetheless, he stayed, activist behind the scenes in a big way, and that's why they targeted him. Sure,
Yeah,
and they tried to kill him several, at least 4 or 5
yeah.
times before they were successful.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna ask you about those times in which they tried to kill him. Like in it was, I think the first one is in Oakland and then in Atlanta. Am I correct? So what can you tell
Right?
us about those times?
Yeah. So the Oakland was for the. It was near Oakland. It was in the Marin City, where he had lived for a period of time with Los Angeles Black Panther leaders Geronimo Pratt's wife, while his godfather Geronimo Pratt was in prison on a false charge, and they the government ended up giving him millions of dollars for false imprisonment. But nonetheless, so Tupac's there. He's invited to be the honorary speaker, or the honorary guest. I'm sorry, at the 50th anniversary of the Marin City Festival, and strangers come up to him and punch him for no reason, and then shoot at him, according to eyewitnesses. And I show all the end notes and footnotes of all the sources for this. And Tupac's bodyguard, his brother was playing his bodyguard, as Matulu Shakur's son, Mopreme Shakur, just grabbed a gun and apparently shot in the air just to ward off the guys that were attacking him. And the attackers started shooting at them. They and right in front of police officers who were security guards at the Marin Fest. They ran, but basically the attackers used the psychological techniques that had been perfected by the FBI to basically create a mob mentality, and kind of got many of the people convinced that Tupac's either Tupac or his bodyguard, his Mopreme had one of the stray bullets of them had hit a kid, hit a boy, 5-year-old, and hurt him or killed him. I can't remember now. I'm sorry to say. But all the witnesses then, said no, it wasn't them. It was the attackers whose gun actually killed that boy, and then that's why Tupac nor Mopreme were ever charged with this. But they attacked him. They tried to beat Tupac to death. Tupac smartly crawled under a police car to save himself, and so in trying to get at him, they were smashing the police car, and the police had to stop it. And they didn't arrest any of the attackers. They just arrested Tupac and Mopreme. And thankfully, Tupac got out of all that, though. They never charged the person that pulled the trigger that hit the boy, and they never just charged any of the attackers or arrested any of the attackers. So then there was Atlanta, where after a concert, Tupac's just driving home after a concert, and eyewitnesses said that these two white guys with someone else, who were just in plain clothes, ran over to Tupac's car, smashed his window, shot at him. He rolled out the back, grabbed the security guard's gun, and shot back in self-defense. And so that's why Tupac never, the case never went through court completely. Now, it turned out that these two white men were police officers, Atlanta police officers. They say they were, just celebrating something, but they obviously, they actually had a gun on them that they had stolen from a police evidence locker. So this was all planned. They knew exactly where Tupac was staying, even though he was staying under an alias, and they charged him, with, attempted homicide. But he was just, acting in self-defense, so it all got dropped. But it really got dropped because they were, it was a botched assassination attempt number 2, I argue. And of course, then there was number 3, at least number 3. There was more than this, but the third big one was in the New York recording studio lobby, where Tupac is drawn to this recording studio lobby by being offered tons of money just to lay down 1 or 2 lines on a rap that someone else is doing. And he comes in the recording studio lobby. 2 supposed muggers, put 1 bullet in him to get him on the ground, face down the ground, and then put 2 bullets in the back of his skull, according to the court, the doctor's affidavit that was submitted in trial. And so 2 bullets went through the back of his skull and out the front of his skull, and just miraculously missed his brain. So that was definitely, that's a military tactic for assassination. Yeah. You supposed to put 2 bullets, put 1 bullet to lay him down, and 2 bullets, through the skull. And so that was another assassination attempt. Police were right nearby, did not go after the assailants who ran out. They had it on videotape. The security guard at the Quad recording studio, which is a top recording studio in New York City, offered the videotape of these assailants to police. They turned it down and closed the case. And so it was obviously yet another, attempt to assassinate Tupac that was, just botched. But of course, they were successful in Las Vegas. And, the award-winning Las Vegas crime reporter said, Kathy Scott basically said that it was the biggest murder case in years in Las Vegas. Yet they had a page and a half of police foul play around that situation. And so the best evidence is now the FBI admitted they had Tupac under surveillance at that time. And they were, and she says, Kathy Scott said FBI were in Tupac's motorcade at that time, and yet they didn't go after the gunmen or the assailants. And because it was, obviously the final assassination attempt that was actually successful.
And then the documentary by, is it Nick Broomfield? Right. It details a lot about, it shows a lot of evidence about how FBI was there at both the Tupac shooting in Las Vegas and the Biggie Smalls shooting in Los Angeles. I recommend everyone check that out. And John Potash was also recommending that in his book for people to check that out. Now, you also mentioned that tactic, that military tactic, the shooting them in the head twice. It happened with other activists in the past. So I like how you drew those connections there, and you were talking about how, I mean, it's very likely the case that this was like a hired assassin who tried to carry this out. And then after the New York shooting of Tupac, he went to jail, and he was only released on bail because Death Row Records and Suge Knight bailed him out. But he never really left the surveillance of intelligence. And there's a lot of evidence that points to Suge Knight possibly being also an informant and Death Row Records being a front by intelligence, right? Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah. Well, Death Row Records, basically Russell Poole, a high-level police detective, got himself assigned to the investigation of Biggie Smalls' murder because of a connected murder he was investigating. And he found dozens, and he said, of his fellow police officers at all levels of Death Row Records. And he said he talked to his superiors and asked them what they're doing there. And the superiors told them you can call them troubleshooters or covert agents. And so he found that Death Row Records was trafficking drugs, trafficking guns, and he believed they set up, they murdered Biggie Smalls in order to cover up their murder of Tupac Shakur. And he says when he wanted to give all of his evidence to the FBI, all his friends warned him not to give his evidence to the FBI. But he said, well, if I can't trust, them, who can I trust? But he gave all his evidence to the FBI and they did nothing with it. But on the other hand, Los Angeles police superiors demoted him, and he eventually had to leave the force just to tell his story. And he told his story to Nick Broomfield, of course, for that film Biggie and Tupac, but also told it to Randall Sullivan for the book Labyrinth. You can see kind of behind me on my bookshelf. And the thing is that those the film and the book are good, and it has the evidence in the book of the Los Angeles. It's basically the New York police officer who also worked for the FBI being in Los Angeles during Biggie's murder and taking pictures of him just before his murder. And good evidence like that, but they don't just go into the history of Tupac's activism and for why Tupac was the primary target and how the FBI were involved, which my book does, of course, both my books. And so in my films, cover these situations too, about the history of the FBI and the evidence that the FBI, of course, set up Tupac's murder along with the CIA. I get more into the CIA angle in Drugs as Weapons Against Us because of the drug angle when he gets all these gangs to stop dealing drugs and takes all that money out of CIA's hands and drug launderers' hands. But it's there's loads of evidence that the police officers in Death Row Records, with Suge Knight being just the low man on the U.S. intelligence totem pole, Reggie Wright Jr. is higher up on the totem pole, and Dave Kenner's even higher up than that, because Kenner was just a white lawyer who obviously had deep connections. He was connected to the CIA drug trafficking of cocaine with Freeway Ricky Ross. He had worked for he had been a lawyer for Freeway Ricky Ross's assistant, Michael Harry O'Harris, who was the real owner of Death Row Records. And he started that Death Row Records with him, putting his own company above Death Row, Godfather Entertainment. So Dave Kenner was the real owner of all that.
And Suge Knight was pretty much untouchable between the years of 1991 and 1996, despite being involved in a lot of crimes, right? Mm-hmm. And this is similar also to Elaine Brown. Was she also like untouchable during the 70s when she was involved with the Black Panthers? And I think there was someone else that you mentioned was like nicknamed Mr. Untouchable or something like that.
Yeah. I mean, there was a few. Well, Elaine Brown was just caught with drug possession, but people like Kathleen Cleaver, who was a national spokesperson for the Black Panthers, and Afeni Shakur has talked about it, and others have talked about how Elaine Brown's version of Huey Newton is not the Huey Newton they knew. And they believe, and Geronimo Pratt believes, and wrote a letter about this with Kathleen Cleaver, helping him get it out, that all the evidence that Elaine Brown was a U.S. intelligence undercover agent that was used to undermine Huey Newton, the national leader of the Black Panther Party, with Bobby Seale, the founder and leader of it. And so Elaine, there's a huge, loads of evidence of that. Elaine Brown tried to sue Geronimo Pratt and Kathleen Cleaver for saying that. A lot of us researchers, myself included, just gave Kathleen Cleaver all of our evidence to support what Geronimo Pratt said, and the judge threw Elaine Brown's case out of court because the evidence was overwhelming against her. And there was a number of undercover agents in the Black Panther Party, and she was just one of many.
And you also mentioned how LAPD is pretty much involved with training police forces in New York and in Atlanta. Is that correct?
So you said, ask that question again. I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Yeah. Was the LAPD, were they involved in training the police forces in Atlanta, Georgia, and in New York City?
Yeah, so basically, it was the New York Police Department that was
Okay.
the first had the
Okay.
first rap unit targeting rappers. Nick Broomfield came out in his film Biggie and Tupac saying that it was found in 1993. Congress formed a special committee on the dangers of rap, political rap, as being subversive. And after that, of course, they had the New York Police Department. Now they'd done this before, but it got more serious and more coordinated. Where New York Police had a list of rappers to really target, and they trained. It came out in Miami Herald in the early 2000s that the Miami Police Department was trained by the New York Police Department, and the Los Angeles Police Department was trained, and cities around the countries had their police departments trained in targeting political rappers, basically. And they pretended like it was just surveillance for, committing crimes. But all the best evidence shows that right after that training in Miami, rappers or rap industry figures started getting killed, started getting murdered. And so, it was later found that they were practicing, counterintelligence program, tactics on rappers, using those kill and tell pro tactics against rappers. And this can still be seen around the country. The last list I saw had over 200 rappers were murdered in just about 2 or 3 years alone, around 2020 to 2022.
Whoa.
Yeah, it's terrible. It's unbelievable what's going on.
And if it's like over 200, like it's not,
Just
it's not gonna be like the mainstream rappers. It's gonna be the up and coming ones. So even if they see potential there, they're like, we're not gonna risk having this person become big enough to
yeah,
the point where they can influence the minds of people and start questioning things.
right, right. Yeah.
It What was it? It was when NWA came up in 1988. They come out with their first album, Straight Outta Compton, and it wasn't entirely all political except for like
Mhm.
songs like "F the Police,"
Right.
and other things like thrown in there. Like groups like Public Enemy were more political.
Hmm.
Disposable Heroes of Hip Hoppercy were more
Hmm.
political.
Sure.
The coup came later on, but
Right.
that appeal though, it was really popular, and there was a lot of potential to politicize a
Hmm.
lot of people who were involved in gangs or who lived in these poor black and brown communities who were not informed enough about um, the war against drugs and other things like that are keeping them oppressed.
Yeah, I mean the
Um,
war on us, but with the use of drugs is a war on us. Sure.
yeah, yeah, and it was Ice Cube left in like '89,
Mhm.
but then like in '91, that was when Dr. Dre left, and he left with Suge Knight to start Death Row Records. Um, do you think that part of the reason why Death Row Records was started is because U.S. intelligence found NWA really threatening and politicizing a lot of
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Suge Knight and others were sent in to try to take apart that NWA.
right,
Yes, and they did. They took away DOC from them. Then they lured Dre out of there, and then Dre had to leave Death Row with nothing, even though he was the creative force behind Death Row Records. That helped Snoop Dogg become big. And helped Tupac, become even bigger. But of course, Snoop Dogg and Tupac were incredibly uh, creative on their own. But Dre started Death Row being, the musical force it was. And so, yeah, Death Row Records. All the best evidence is that Death Row Records was a U.S. intelligence front company,
yeah,
started by U.S. intelligence to. I mean, granted, they had some great rappers in there too, but all those rappers left. Most of them left scared. Snoop Dogg left scared of Suge Knight. Suge Knight had a warning against him for saying that he thought that Suge Knight was helped Tupac get killed. And so, yeah, it's ugly, but that's the best evidence. And you can see that evidence in my book and film.
yeah. Like they were helping to instigate to break the truce between the Bloods and the Crips
Yes,
that Tupac helped form.
right. And
And
Tupac did that with his Black Panther extended family, where Tupac was
yeah,
instrumental in getting the Bloods and Crips to sign peace truces and to shake hands and agree to the code of thug life, which would have made them, be more ethical in their illegal activities, if not
right,
give up drug dealing completely.
right. It's interesting also, like knowing all of that, it starts to make more sense why Suge Knight kept instigating for Dr. Dre to release all these tracks that were like diss tracks against Eazy-E, Eazy-E, the
Hmm.
owner of Ruthless Records, um, one of the founders of NWA also,
Hmm.
and but it was while Tupac was in jail when Eazy-E died of AIDS. But that whole situation is also a bit shady, from what I've looked into. Like he, after he got it, it was like he only had it for like 2 weeks before he died. None of his sexual partners had it. None of his kids had it or have it now. Um,
I didn't write about that, but I've
yeah,
heard things like what you're saying. I mean, and just to create a segue, if you don't mind,
right.
it's funny that it's interesting that Nirvana, the band Nirvana, said that they listened to NWA Straight Outta Compton constantly when they were touring. They loved
Right.
that album, and I think that, and Kurt Cobain was actually very political.
Yeah.
He said for his first album, Nevermind, he wanted to put all kinds of radical political essays about anarchistic essays about how to make your own bomb, and he always was making comments about the capitalists and and how when they he said when he was going to be on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine, he said, I'll only be on the cover if you let me wear a shirt that corporate magazines still suck.
Yeah.
And so he was very political. He was very leftist, radical leftist, slash anarchist, and he was a threat because of that. You know, and yeah, there was a number of things that when after he died, the rest of Nirvana did play at the protest against the World Trade Organization, and it just wasn't as big of a thing because it was without Kurt Cobain. But if Cobain was still alive when they played that, it would have been a much bigger deal. So it's really a shame that they seem to have placed Courtney Love in her life, in his life. I'm sorry, in
Yeah.
Kurt Cobain's life, in order to control him, to get him using heroin regularly for the first time in his life,
Yeah.
and probably because of his massive stomach problem, and then to help aid with the setup of his murder that was called a suicide.
And before that, Kurt Cobain wasn't using heroin that much. It was like
He only
he
tried
said it
a
was like
few
a rare
times in
thing,
his
right?
life. He only tried a few times in his life, he said in his memoir, just for his horrible stomach problem, which was agonizing him. And when he finally, found a cure to his stomach problem, he hadn't used heroin for at least a year. He said in an interview, and the blood tests in Rome when he supposedly went into a coma for because basically Courtney Love roofied him. You know, he had no heroin in his system. And anyone who knows heroin knows you can't go, more than a day or two without heroin, or your withdrawals would be massive and horrible. And so he had no illegal substances in his blood, in his bloodstream. When he was in the hospital a month or so before his death, and so he was not a heroin addict. Before he died, he
Yeah.
had basically was in recovery, and yet. And so she, someone, guy named Eldon Hoke, said that one film, and Nick Broomfield did a different film, one called Kurt and Courtney, where he's Eldon Hoke on there saying that Courtney Love offered me $50,000 to kill Kurt Cobain. She had a map of the house where he lived. He described it all. He says, I was going to take that money, but I was on tour and I missed it, but I know who did take that. And he started to say the name, and he actually said it for another journalist, and so I have the name in my book. And so the best evidence is that Courtney Love did hire someone to kill Kurt Cobain. Now the question is, like, why was it so covered up? Why did Tom Grant, a former Los Angeles police detective turned private investigator, why did he come up with so much evidence that Kurt Cobain was murdered and give all that evidence to both the Seattle police and his former Los Angeles police departments, and no one look at it? And and the best evidence is it was covered up because it was a much higher level murder. Apparently, the best evidence is that Courtney Love, being a prostitute in her teen years, being sexually and sexually abused throughout her childhood by her own words, according to her biological father, who was estranged from her because custody of her was taken away from him at an early age by Courtney Love's extremely wealthy grandparents. And so Courtney wrote a letter to him saying that all my counselors abused me from age about 3 years old onwards. And she started describing when she was 13 years old and wrote him a letter to get her out of juvenile detention. She said they gave me these drugs that were all MKUltra, CIA Project MKUltra, psychohypnotic drugs that are used with hypnosis and to create, like basically someone with dissociative identity disorder or dissociative disorder. And when someone has dissociative disorder or the more complex dissociative identity disorder, which used to be called multiple personality disorder, the CIA's Project MKUltra had a project where they could create that through sexual abuse, drugs, and hypnosis. And several people testified before a presidential commission about how they were created that way to be CIA assets. And these women who testified with their therapist described the different people that were parts of MKUltra, some of which were involved in the experimentations on them. And the therapist said that she was only given a week or two to prepare for this, these hearings to testify. And loads of therapists called her and said, I've got patients just like yours. Please tell the commission that there's many, many more people out there like this. These women were about the same age as Courtney Love. They were actually, one was from the same area as Courtney Love in the Northwest. And so it's like all the best evidence is that, and according to her biological father, when she was prostituting for the Japanese mafia at one point. Mm-hmm. There's a letter. This is one biographer, who's a veteran journalist, said she had a letter. She got a letter from a former boyfriend saying that she prostituted in, I believe it was Taiwan. And so when she visited her biological father in Ireland, where he was doing research for a book, she brought 1,000 hits of acid with her to Ireland, just turned 17. And then an undercover agent named Steve O'Leary had befriended her father and then took Courtney Love to England, where she distributed loads of acid to musicians and other drugs to musicians. And this copied CIA's Project MKUltra's director, Robert Lashbrook, who had done the same thing in the 1960s. Yeah. He, according to A.E. Hotchner, who was Ernest Hemingway's editor, the CIA director, assistant director, Robert Lashbrook, went to England with loads of acid, loads of agents, and loads of money, and directed those agents to get acid in as many musicians' hands as possible. And here was Courtney Love doing the same thing. Now, Courtney Love then repeated that in many major American cities, passing out loads of different drugs, including acid, like candy, throughout these punk music scenes, throughout the United States, Portland, Los Angeles, Seattle, and got married to a guy, the top punk rocker in Los Angeles, who said he thought he was marrying some radical feminist. And it turns out he married like a conservative Phyllis Diller type, who says that she used to sleep with Army generals in Alaska, and they told her that wars were good for us, and used to hire mafia to come, or hitmen to come, like, beat him up when he didn't do what she said. And finally he divorced her, but then she got herself in place to entrap Kurt Cobain, got pregnant after a few dates. and he did the right thing and married her, but only with a prenuptial agreement. And then, of course, that was the setup for those two to actually promote the heroin. Tupac was, I'm sorry, Kurt Cobain was inadvertently promoting heroin by popularizing it with her, just inadvertently, as I say. But then when he cleaned himself up and got away from all drugs, according to bandmates, friends, and the blood test, that's when they had to do him in. And that popularized heroin like crazy. Every year that he was, throughout the 1990s, from like 91 onwards, the heroin use went up by 10% in the United States.
And that was like around the time also when movies like Pulp Fiction were also depicting heroin use and all that. Other movies also were doing that, which you mentioned in the book. She was also came from. There's a place in Los Angeles that you bring up in your book, Drugs as Weapons Against Us, that was like a center for. There's a lot of people who were involved with intelligence who had kids who then became musicians in the 1960s. You mentioned some of them were like Frank Zappa, Jim Morrison from The Doors. Was Courtney Love was also came from that? Did she not? Or
well, she actually didn't come from that area. So that area became big in the 1960s.
Okay.
And that area was called Laurel Canyon. It was a neighborhood in Los Angeles, in the Los Angeles metropolitan area. And Laurel Canyon was an area where so many musicians flocked to and became instantly famous. This guy from the Mamas and the Papas, John Phillips, I believe his name was. He and David Crosby and Frank Zappa all came from these high-level military families. Now,
the Grateful Dead too, right?
Well, the Grateful Dead actually was in the San Francisco area more.
Oh, okay.
But it was the same ilk because of the fact that the Grateful Dead was part of these kind of acid test parties, and they were like, that's where they really got their start, and promoting acid like crazy. And the people all around the Grateful Dead, these people they call themselves the pranksters. They were founded by a guy named Ken Kesey, who was a writer, but he had, in order to make money while he was in graduate school for writing, Kesey took part in a project MKUltra acid test, like a basically MKUltra experiment where they gave him LSD in order to see how it would affect him, but they gave him $100 for taking it. $100 is actually a lot more money back then, of course, in the 1960s when he took it. And so then they gave him a job at the hospital that allowed him to steal the acid and give it out at parties. He held constant parties at a place he stayed in graduate school in Stanford, near in the San Francisco Bay Area. And then he started this group called the Pranksters, who surrounded him. Were actually a number of people that were in the military then became part of this group that basically, it turns out, best evidence is that manipulated Ken Kesey to keep promoting acid by painting a bus psychedelic, taking it through the Civil Rights South, promoting it to all these black and white activists down in the South, all this acid down there, and then promoting it in Harlem right after the Harlem riots, then coming back and holding these acid test parties with the Grateful Dead playing each party, where they had vats of Kool-Aid that they called electric Kool-Aid, because it was, after a book was written about it called Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, but basically they had spiked this Kool-Aid, vats of Kool-Aid with acid. And so some people knew they were taking acid and some people didn't, but they held tons of parties throughout, throughout San Francisco, then throughout Los Angeles, including right after the riots in Los Angeles, which are really race rebellions. And so that's what they were doing, is they were using, they were the best evidence is they were part of MKUltra, just like Timothy Leary when he was doing MKUltra work at Harvard, experimenting on students that needed the money with acid on them. Then he was kicked out of Harvard, but then took these parties to the mansion of a guy named William Mellon Hitchcock and his sister, and started a group called something like the Eternal Freedom, whatever group, that held constant parties just an hour north of New York City, and lured all these artists and musicians from New York City up to the mansion where MKUltra scientists and agents just tried all kinds of different psychedelics on all these artists and got them to promote it as best they could. But that was what that whole scene was about. But on Laurel Canyon, you had all these musicians that got instant fame, instant stardom. Despite that, they didn't seem to have that much talent, believe it or not. Some did, some didn't. But many of them didn't. And they had a professional band that had the real talent called the Wrecking Crew. That was the real talent behind these guys. But they basically had these drug and sex parties with these women that were kind of runaways that I argue were MKUltra victims or subjects, just like Courtney Love was. But Courtney Love was a different age. Courtney Love was born about 1964, whereas these women were already teenagers by the mid 1960s, and so they were having these sex and drug parties to lure actors and musicians to come for the wild, crazy, sex, and get lured into using all different kinds of drugs, and then promote those drugs thereafter. Especially British musicians, they particularly tried to lure. They got the Beatles, with John Lennon and George Harrison using acid for a second time. The first time they were dosed by their dentist, by George Harrison's dentist.
Crazy.
Yeah, dosed against their will by George Harrison's dentist.
Which you also wrote in your book, how the dentist was likely also coming from like British intelligence, or there's some kind of connection there.
The evidence was that his father was a police officer. The police officer doesn't make that much money in Britain, but this guy all of a sudden had huge money to come all the way to the United States for special training in Northwestern for dentistry, and at a place where Northwestern has military contracts, many military contracts, and so this guy, the best evidence is that he was just following through with Robert Lashbrook's plan, because Robert Lashbrook came in January 1965 to London. And it was later in that spring when this dentist dosed, George Harrison and John Lennon. And so obviously he was following through with that same program, because then another London undercover agent, and this came out in the Daily Mail, the daily newspaper of London, that this other guy, I forget his name off the top of my head, but basically he was a Frank Schneiderman, or I think it was Schneiderman. He went by different names though. He was called the Acid King, and he went to Mick Jagger was a holdout from acid, and so the Rolling Stones was having a party, and this guy finally convinced Mick Jagger to try some tea that had acid in it, and then a few hours later, the police raid the party, and Mick Jagger's arrested, and they said he was using acid, so they used that incident to promote acid and pretend like Mick Jagger always used acid when he didn't, according to the best sources. And meanwhile, they didn't arrest Schneiderman at all. Schneiderman's allowed to let go with tons of drugs in his briefcase. And so that's just some of the what they did. So at these sex and drug parties, though, in Laurel Canyon, they were obviously used. That was an intelligence operation. The best evidence is to get push drugs on the celebrities, to get them to promote it to everybody, to get everyone using drugs. And these are just some of the different operations. But yeah, Zappa's father was a scientist at Edgewood Arsenal, which is the chemical warfare area in right above me. And I live in Baltimore, and this is just maybe 40 minutes north of me. So yeah, his father was in charge of MKUltra projects there at Edgewood Arsenal, and was involved in MKUltra projects. And Zappa turned on his family, though. Eventually he told a rock reporter who interviewed me about my book. That rock reporter said that Zappa told him that the CIA was giving acid to hippies, and and so he turned on them, and said, "So I think he died young." sadly enough. And Jim Morrison may have turned on his family too.
I was gonna ask that. Yeah.
I didn't have time to get into Jim Morrison's and explore Jim Morrison's death as much as the fact that his father was the naval commander of the ship that was involved in the Gulf of Tonkin incident that started the Vietnam War, and that's no coincidence there.
Yeah. Yeah, because Jim Morrison's also part of that 27 Club from artists who died in the late 60s and 70s, which includes Jimi Hendrix
Mm-hmm.
and who else is it? Brian Jones.
Brian
And
Jones. And so I talk heavily about Jones and drugs as weapons against us. Brian Jones founded the Rolling Stones.
yeah,
Janis Joplin was getting very political when she died. Jimi Hendrix was getting extremely political when he died. He was talking about supporting the Black Panthers, dedicated his last album to the Black Panthers. And best evidence is that his manager, who admitted being British MI6, which is British CIA, was basically behind his death. Who he admitted, and Mike Jeffrey admitted when he was drunk that he was behind behind killing Jimi Hendrix. To two different people. So
yeah, and Jimi Hendrix died shortly after he fired him too, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
Within 48 hours of firing, Mike Jeffries, Hendrix ends up dead. And it's similar to Tupac. Tupac had fired Dave Kenner, and within days of firing Dave Kenner, he ends up dead.
That's something that I forgot to ask you to mention also, how after Tupac was released from prison, he had to get a different manager. Before that, he was being managed by former Black Panthers, right? Yeah, and he had to get a different manager when he was with Death Row Records, and also that's when he started using marijuana a lot more. He would use it before, but didn't he make a good plea that he wasn't gonna like smoke as much anymore? But then when he got into Death Row Records, he started smoking and drinking more.
Yeah, it's pretty. They're not all perfectly similar paths and all, but Tupac, Cobain, Hendrix, and Lennon all have similar kind of paths that when they were, they at different points they each were political, but then when they started sobering up and turning more to activism, they all died young. And so Tupac had vowed to stop drinking and smoking weed when he was too stoned to realize he was being set up that New York quad recording studio. And, and that when they attempted to kill him there, so when he was in prison, he did stay away from, of course, weed. You can get weed in prison pretty easily, but he stayed away from weed and drinking. When he got out, he Suge Knight constantly fed him, weed and alcohol and got him using. But then when he started sobering up, and Russell Simmons of Def Jam, founder of Def Jam, said that he was at a party with Tupac and other rappers, and everybody's smoking weed and drinking, and Tupac wouldn't touch any weed or alcohol and was just dancing the whole night. And Tupac had gotten engaged to Quincy Jones's daughter, Dada Jones, and they were trying to get their own place, move out of the death row apartment they were living in, get their own place, and planning to have a baby. And so Tupac was sobering up then, and before he was killed.
Yeah. It was what was it? It was with it wasn't Jimi Hendrix's wife also. She was like threatened because she was writing about his life, right? She was writing a biography of Jimi Hendrix and how he was. They were trying to portray him as this guy who was like constantly using like acid and things, but it's not entirely accurate, right? Towards the end of his life, he was trying to get off of it.
Right. So the other pattern between all these musicians I talk about is that they were inadvertently manipulated to promote drugs, but then when they started sobering up and turning more into activism, they were killed. And that's the story with Jimi Hendrix. Yes, he was sobering up. She vowed. She said she did get her book out about him after Mike Jeffries stole her book, and before there was a lot of multiple copies of books and stuff. Stole her book, and then she rewrote it. And so a year after she put her book out showing that he was getting away from any heavy drugs. He only tried heroin once or twice in his life, but he didn't stop taking acid. He stopped anything else. Just smoked weed a little here or there and drank a little here or there. But when and he turned on to, and she talked all about his political activist plans and all he was doing and trying to get Bob Dylan involved with his activist plans. And Brian Jones, it turns out, actually had temporarily convinced Hendrix and John Lennon to form a supergroup with him before he died. But Hendrix was very serious about the activism, and then of course dies suddenly.
Yeah, yeah, and also aside from artists, there's also evidence to show that intelligence was using drugs as a weapon against politicians to try to um, have them lose credibility. Like right before they're gonna give a speech, they dose them with
Yeah.
acid, like they spike their drink, and then
So
they just start mumbling in their speech and things like that, right?
right. So the real focus of my book isn't these musicians as much as these political groups. The Black Panthers, they targeted Huey Newton with cocaine, Elaine Brown and other women targeted try to get Huey Newton hooked on cocaine. They got Afeni Shakur, undercover agents. The best evidence is got Afeni Shakur, Tupac's mom, hooked on cocaine. So they used these drugs against the Black Panthers. They, top Black Panther leaders. They used them against the Students for Democratic Society and the Weathermen, the offshoot of the Students for Democratic Society, who turned more militant and started blowing up buildings around the country that were associated with the Vietnam War or associated with repression of civil rights and Black, activists. And so when things were happening with different Black Panthers, they would blow up. They blew up a judge's house, believe it or not. That was the judge for Afeni Shakur's trial. There's a lot of different militant activists, things they were doing, but they were targeted with acid, and no doubt about it. There was undercover agents that were dosed, for example, the leader of the Columbia SDS, Students for Democratic Society, guy named Mark Rudd. They put acid in his drink, and George Demley was the undercover agent that did that, and that comes out in Acid Dreams, the book Acid Dreams, as well as a memoir by I forget the activist's name now. So this is some of the evidence that they were targeting these top activist groups, top anti-war groups, and top civil rights activist groups throughout the country.
Yeah, throughout the country, but also in the global South too, right? The Congolese leaders, leaders in South America too. They would spike them with acid.
Yeah, so they had it came out in ABC News that they had Che Guevara and Castro on their psychedelic hit list, to try to dose them with acid and hurt their minds. They had Black leaders in the in the African countries on their hit list, psychedelic hit list, and they were targeting leftist activists all over the world. Now the term leftist has been kind of perverted with the in the current American system of things because of it's hard to explain, but basically I call leftist anyone who's anti-war and pro-civil rights and pro equality for all. So I'll just term it that way for now.
Yeah, and then what was it? So you get into like the evidence, the scientific evidence of how these drugs affect people's minds, and it can affect critical thinking, and can also cause them to not be as motivated to be politically active. So what sorts of evidence do you discuss in this book about that?
Yeah, well, I show the scientific studies about acid. Acid was the top drug of MKUltra, but they used either acid or BZ against, for example, the top Black singer Paul Robeson. Paul Robeson Jr. Has given interviews about this, which I have in my film. Now his father was targeted with acid. He slipped into his drink. Likely undercover agents in Russia and Soviet Union slipped into his drink, and then they actually dosed Paul Robeson Jr. too when he was an adult. Came over to see what was happening with his father, and they made Paul Robeson Sr. think he was going crazy. Paul Robeson Jr. said it was either acid or a super psychedelic called BZ, which were both part of CIA's Project MKUltra. But yeah, all the best studies show that this really hurts our minds for our best critical mental activities, and we need our best activities to fight the oligarchs and the wealthiest families in the world that are trying to control us. And I mean, I'm not pro or anti drug. I really don't care. I had my own drug problem when I was younger, but I was glad to get away from that. I was lucky not to develop a full-fledged addiction, though I do psychotherapy for a living. And when I started out with addictions counseling, expertise in addictions counseling. But I just say that people can do whatever they want with drugs. The problem is that while we're getting high and we're not keeping our mind the sharpest, it's going to be really hard to fight these wealthiest families who can buy so many people off and so many groups off. And we got to be as creative as possible and lucid as possible, or else they're going to just roll over us, because even though we're more people, if we're all doped up and messed up in our, whatever, smoking weed every day or taking mushrooms or whatever else, we're not going to be at our best, our sharpest to be creative to fight the good fight.
Right. From what it looks like, they're trying to steer people off and to get too into, the drug scene to the point where they're distracted at that point.
Yeah.
So yeah. And you didn't really touch on this much on your books because it was focusing more on how drugs were used as a weapon. But you also talked about Bob Marley and how his death was probably caused by someone who gave him a shoe that was spiked with some cancer-causing agent, and then he developed cancer later, right?
Yeah. Eyewitness Lee confirmed that that he was at the scene. He was the cinematographer. He was a former Black Panther who was half Asian, half Black, turned into a cinematographer and then a filmmaker. He wrote great film, All Power to the People. And Lee was there as a witness when he saw that happen, where this guy who kind of became part of his film crew, he didn't know who he was, and he later found out that it was William Colby, the CIA director's son. It infiltrated his film crew and got to Bob Marley, gave him these gift shoes, and the natural thing to do is to try on the shoes in the Rasta community. Tries on the shoe, he gets stabbed by some sharp piece of metal on his toe. No one thought anything of it until a few months later when Bob Marley's playing soccer and got cancer in that toe. And I showed the MKUltra documents that say that they were working on a fast cancer-causing agent, and they were developing success with that. But Bob Marley got cancer in that toe. It spread throughout his body, and it's what eventually killed him, sadly enough. This is after they tried to, undercover agents. Well, basically a group in Jamaica said they were paid by the CIA to go and shoot up Bob Marley's home, and they shot Rita Marley, his wife. They shot his manager, and they shot Marley, but Marley, wasn't killed then.
Yeah, and I wouldn't be surprised if he used similar tactics too on like political leaders or revolutionaries in other countries, just to, there are problems, so they want to get rid of that.
All the time, and I talk about that in my book too. But especially with Che Guevara, of course, they hunted down Che Guevara and killed him, sadly enough. But the CIA was involved with the cocaine coups in Latin America, using Nazi fugitives who they got down there to start overthrowing leftists throughout Latin America and all that.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to wrap it up soon because I just don't.
Oh yeah, I was just about to ask you for some closing remarks that you want to leave the audience with.
Yeah. So, thanks so much for the interview, Frank. And I just want to say that I have a book and 2 books. Drugs as Weapons Against Us, and the FBI War on Tupac Shakur, and Black Leaders. So the new book is the subtitle is State Repression of Black Leaders from the Civil Rights Era of the 1960s.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, to the 1990s, I mean. And the second book, Drugs as Weapons Against Us, they're both also now films, but the Drugs as Weapons Against Us film can be found many places. But and then I have a new film called Shots, Eugenics to Pandemics, that's available for free on Tubi, adless on Google Play, and the DVD is 15 plus bonus scene minutes. And for Drugs as Weapons Against Us, the CIA War on Musicians and Activists, that film, with that film, the DVD has 12 plus bonus scene minutes. You know, if you want to check that out on Amazon or Barnes and Noble.
For sure, yeah. And I do want to say also that it was the FBI war on Tupac Shakur was endorsed by Mumia Abu Jamal, and just wanted to get the word out there to
Yeah,
we
Fred
gotta
Hampton
help
Jr.
free
wrote,
Mumia. Yeah.
yeah, Fred Hampton Jr. Wrote an afterword for the book. But yes, free
Yeah.
Mumia as soon as possible. And my website is John Potash, JOHNPOTASH.com.
All right, thanks a lot, John, for coming on the show. It was
Thanks for having me on,
really
Frank.
an honor. Take
It's
care.
great talking to you. Thanks so much.